Welcome back to Inside the Pastor Study Podcast. My name is Pastor Jeremy.
And I'm Pastor George.
And we're finally back with you. We kind of took a little hiatus there last week,
didn't we? A
little
bit of a break, yeah.
Yeah, it was a weird week here in the office. We had the holiday Monday, which is, typically we record on Mondays. And so we had that day off. And then it was a shortened week for us, and it felt really intense. We decided we were going to record on Tuesday, and that didn't work out. We were going to record on Thursday. That didn't work out. And so sorry about that. For those of you who were stuck listening to that like bottom of the barrel podcast that you only get to when there's nothing else, our apologies. But we're back and we're here, and we're excited to be back in the studio recording today.
I guess that's part of pastoral life, right? Sometimes it's you're overwhelmed. A lot of times, quite honestly, I'm not going to say boring, but it's very routine. There are activities we just normally do. We normally participate. The week is structured. And then all of a sudden you'll have a week when everything happens. And
Yeah. I remember when I first started, I was chatting with the senior pastor. I'm like, what does an office day look like? Because they don't tell you this stuff in seminary, right? Like,
right.
They give you all that theology. We've talked, we've been here a bit, but they give you all of that theology. And I was happy my seminary experience had all this extra stuff on leadership, which, you don't always get. But then once I unpacked all my books and sat down in my office chair, I was like, what do I do? And I remember going to the senior pastor I was working with at the time and saying, hey, what happens in here? Like, what do I actually start doing? And he's like, don't worry, it'll find you. And
it does. It does.
Yeah, he's like, just enjoy the quiet because it's not going to last. And you have these weeks where I've said this to people who have asked. Like, I have weeks in pastoral ministry where I have like 20 hours of work, and I'll just kind of sit there in my office. I'll catch up on some reading, I'll have some conversations with people, but there's just not a lot to do. And I early on, I would get kind of frustrated in those weeks. Like, what else is going on? But now I've kind of learned to just cherish those because they don't last.
No.
Because on the other side of that are the 60, 70, 80-hour weeks. So last week on a shortened week, and this is when it usually happens on these shorter weeks, it was a busy one. So,
and the funny thing is, now we're at a point where we're pretty much pre-COVID at Marsh, and we had cut our office hours back just to try and manage that a little bit easier. And last week, with the shortened week, we still expanded our hours.
We're back to our pre-COVID office hours.
Yeah, we came back to our pre-COVID office hours, which that just meant we were working here in this building instead of working someplace else. But
right.
It still was a crazy week.
Yeah, it was. So here we are. We're starting off our week with you, and I'm thrilled about that. We started last time we were together. We started a new segment in our podcast. We was it the theological word of the week?
The theological term of the week.
So, so we're back to theological word of the week. What do you have in mind for this week? What is the theological word of the week?
The theological word of the week is eternal.
Eternal.
I feel like, and I'm starting with that word and starting with the concept of presuppositionalism from last week, because I think we should talk first of all about God. If our presuppositions is that we begin with God, then it's kind of unusual for us to go and start with the Bible. That's kind of where systematic theology starts, is how do I know God exists? Let's just talk about God and figuring out what God is, and then we'll move toward the idea of.
So are you going to go through the 10 characteristics of God?
I would love to.
Right.
That would be fantastic.
So our next 9 weeks, we're going to do those.
Exactly.
Awesome.
Right.
So there's a little preview. Some of you guys who have some Presbyterian background, you're like, oh, I know these. That's great. Don't tell anybody. It'll be a surprise.
It'll be fun.
So eternal. This one's weird. What's the difference between eternal and, let's say, infinite, or let's say everlasting? Are those all synonyms?
So they aren't. And you mentioned the word infinite, and that's going to be part of our conversation in a couple weeks. That's another good theological word of the day for God. But eternal is Eternal is different from everlasting, and we get these messed up. We overlap them quite a bit. For example, John 3:16, right? We quote that verse, and it says, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in him will not perish, but has everlasting life," is what the text says. And we often say that because we've trusted Christ, we have eternal life, and those are two different things. So here's how you can envision it, if you will. Everlasting life is what we as human beings have. We have a starting point. That is our birth or our conception. That is our starting point. And from that point, we will face human death, death because of our sin, but then we are everlasting in that we will face judgment and will either spend eternity in heaven or eternity in hell. So there is a concept of everlasting. Every human being is everlasting. God is eternal. And the concept of eternal is just like we have this starting point. God doesn't have a starting point. God goes forward in an everlasting way, but he also goes backwards in an everlasting way. The psalmist, I think it's Moses actually in Psalm 90 who says, "From everlasting to everlasting, you are God." And that's an interesting idea. God doesn't have a starting point. So when we're talking about eternal, we're saying God doesn't have a starting point. He doesn't have an ending point. He is just I guess you could say he's just a continuum.
Okay. So is the idea of eternity for us a misnomer?
That's an interesting question. That's a really good one. I think in the fact that we are entering into God's eternity, no, it's not.
Okay.
We will enter into his rest, into eternity with him, into the future eternity. But yeah, on the other hand,
Because you're talking about an eternal, eternity in hell, right? So
yes.
is hell eternal? Has it always existed?
Yeah, no, I would say that hell is created.
Yeah.
So here's the thing. If anything is eternal other than God, it's equal with God.
Yeah.
So everything else is created because only God is eternal.
Right. Because if you get into that other side, let's say hell is eternal. Hey, did you think we were going here today? This is fun. This is pastor stuff, folks.
Yes.
So if hell is eternal, then the idea, that whole like Eastern religion yin yang thing makes a lot of
The
sense.
dualism concept.
Now you're moving into dualism.
Right.
Right? So both of these forces are eternal and they compete against one another. Or they hold each other in balance. But a Christian does not believe that. A Christian doesn't believe in dualism. A Christian does not believe that hell and evil hold God in balance and God holds off hell and evil so that there can be balance. God's not concerned with balance.
God's not concerned with balance. Absolutely not. Because he's eternal. He always has been. There is a sense then in which we have to say that God is, and here we go into scary theology again. God is the creator of hell.
Yeah. Uh-oh.
Yeah. Yeah, he has to be the creator of all of these things because he is the primary origin. He's eternal. Mm-hmm. And he's the only eternal in the entire mix. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So here's one of those places where we get into problems with this as humans, and that is that we are very time structured and time.
Right.
All of our lives are measured by time.
Especially in our culture, right? Like, so there are some cultures that see time more relatively than we do.
Right.
And then there are people within our culture who are more bound by time than others, right? Like
yes.
You have, I am one of those, if you're on time, you're late people. But we all have that friend who is running 15 minutes late to church, but they're carrying fresh Starbucks in their hand, right? Like so time has some flexibility with us, but we still all are bound by it.
All of it, because all of us have a beginning, and all of us have an end. At least an earthly end. All of us will die, and there is this struggle in our human comprehension because everything as humans begins. We all have time, and we all measure time. We all comprehend time in one way or another. Although there's an interesting conversation about time because in our current culture, the current philosophy, I guess, of our day, time is less important when it comes. We don't, for example, what I'm getting at is we don't necessarily measure our current existence by history. The complaint of many historians right now is that history is non-existent prior to your birth. So, one of my more interesting moments, 20 years ago at the turn of the century, at the 2000, the millennium, there was a conversation about who was the most important person in the millennium of England, and this was a survey done in the United Kingdom of the English peoples. And what was very interesting is that in the millennium, in the 1,000 years of English reign that had come before that, which goes all the way back to William the Conqueror and the establishment of Norman rule in England in 1066, the two most important people in English history for the millennium were Winston Churchill and Diana, the princess.
Sure.
And that's because because
if you're going to survey people from a particular era, then they're going to talk about the person or people that have most impacted them, not most impacted history.
Completely. And I mean, I remember pulling my hair out and saying, Diana Spencer? How can she be an important person in the millennium when you have...
I don't know. I've watched The Crown. She's pretty amazing.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, okay. But...
All right. So... there's so much weight to this, and I think this is one of friends. When you see a bumper sticker that talks about how all religions are the same, like if you start to get into theology and understand some of these things, you get when you learn the nuance of certain words, then you can start to see why we're different from other cultures and other religions. And this is a big one: the idea of eternal versus everlasting. Because think about this: like if human beings are everlasting, we have a starting point but no ending point. That puts us in conflict with other people with other cultures and religions that have tried to figure out this sense of continuum. There is a sense of eternity. God puts eternity in our hearts is one of the things that we have talked about. And so other cultures, because there is this sense that eternity is a thing and must exist, believe that humans are eternal, and they don't have a starting point either. They just have a point in which they die and regenerate into something else.
Well, exactly. Now, for example, Buddhism is your hope is to achieve nirvana. Mm-hmm. Nirvana is...
It's a chance to end the cycle.
It's the chance to end the cycle. You cease to actually exist. So the objective in Buddhism is to become so good that you cease to exist, because then you end all suffering in your existence.
Right.
Because you don't exist.
Right.
So it's kind of like the opposite of Christianity. There's a lot of folks who get confused with Buddhism and Christianity. Like,
there are some common values.
Right. Christianity talks about the value of suffering. Buddhism talks about the value of suffering. Christianity talks about the value of suffering because it puts us closer to and more in identification with the joy of being without sin in an everlasting existence with God. Whereas Buddhism says that my suffering just means that I won't have to pay this penalty in the future, and someday I'll be free of all suffering. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So very, very interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there you go. Eternity versus everlasting. There is
Exactly.
a difference. Knowing that nuance is going to help you speak more intelligently to someone else who has great questions about your faith, but it also kind of informs us too. Our God is eternal, and we are everlasting.
Exactly.
if you don't know us personally, right? Like if your only experience with us is this podcast, like we've hinted a bit at some of our interests outside of pastoral ministry. And here's the thing, like as a pastor, my interests, even the ones that exist outside of the Venn diagram of pastor, all overlap at some point into my pastoral worldview, because that's a piece. Like as a Christian, I view the world through this lens of Scripture and what Jesus has done in my life, and I also view the world through the lens of a pastor. And that includes the stuff we watch and the kind of entertainment that we go after and enjoy. And recently, we both enjoy Disney things. We like being at Disney, which puts us in conflict, I think, with some Christians. That's okay.
Right.
Yeah, we're cool with that. I understand why you don't like them. I also like them. It's okay. So we both recently watched a movie that Disney released, Cruella, and I think we both came away with very different takes from that, right?
Very much so. And the interesting thing is, I don't think that either of our takes on the movie are anywhere near some of the other things that I've seen written in Christian information, or there's an individual that posted to my Facebook page a review of Cruella from a standpoint that I just found myself scratching my head and saying, I guess they don't know the backstory of this movie. They don't know exactly what they're looking at. But we both came away from this movie. We both have watched it now, and we both have different takes on it. I am I guess that you could call me a Disney-phile. I love Disney stuff. I think you are too.
Yeah.
You know, we, again, like you said, that kind of puts us at odds with some folks who, especially looking at current day Disney stuff, just kind of think that it's vile and offensive, and I get that. I see it too, but I also find it to be some of the better entertainment. But we were watching this movie, and just to preface this, this article that I saw really slammed the movie because the word devil is used in the movie, and
she ends up at Hell Hall, right?
She ends up at Hell Hall, right? And that to me was interesting because it told me that that person had no context from the original animated feature that the Disney Corporation put out in 1964. I think it was 1964, might have been 1965. It was actually Walt's last
the last movie
feature,
he oversaw, right?
Last animated feature, right, that he came out with. It actually hit, I think, just after his death in 1965, 1966.
Okay.
And the interesting thing is the fellow who was the producer or the director of that, was a guy named Ken Anderson, who was one of Walt's famous animators, and he was a Christian. And that's kind of an interesting thing. Ken has written that he's the saddest thing in his life is that his last words with Walt Disney were an argument that he had with Walt over the use of a new, they called it xerographing. Basically what they did with that movie is they basically mimeographed the backgrounds and put the scenery on the front. So Walt hated that. Walt thought that every single background needed to be hand-drawn.
Right. It was a revolution in animation that they had pioneered, but Walt wanted the old way.
Walt wanted it all hand-drawn.
But that changed how Disney did it. You're from 101 Dalmatians through what the next era was Little Mermaid began the new era.
Right, Little Mermaid starts the new way.
Yeah, so that all of those movies in between, you have a very distinct art style, right?
Yes.
And it's with that single cell in the background with the moving things in the front.
Right, and Walt hated that.
Yeah.
He thought that was cheap. And here's a guy who's Walt was on the cutting edge of just about everything innovative when it came to animation. And he hated this innovation. He thought it was cheap. He thought that they were really destroying the frames. And Anderson says that he's saddened that his last conversation with Walt was this argument about xerographing. And But anyway, that movie contains all of these things. Hell Hall exists in the animated feature.
Yep.
And Cruella's license plate on her Roadster is DEVIL, devil, and kind of a takeoff of a DeVille.
Yeah. Even though it's like a Zenith or something. Yeah, some kind of other. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, and her name is Cruel Devil. I mean, that's kind of the idea of the. Yeah,
Yes. And so here's the thing. And here's the thing that is quintessential Disney.
Okay.
And maybe it's what creates the dissonance in this movie for me. I will tell you right now, I did not like the movie, but I liked the movie.
Okay. I liked the movie. You liked the movie. So go ahead. Yeah.
So the dissonance is, and it's a dissonance that has been happening in the Disney Studios productions probably for the last 10, 15 years. And that is Walt Disney believed in good and evil. He was probably a good Episcopalian who had some understanding of God, but probably didn't know God. I would love to be pleasantly surprised in heaven, but he was a good man, and he had a clear understanding. He had a clear moral compass that identified what good was and what evil was. And Walt specified to all of his artists and all of his story writers that they were never to let evil win. What he wanted in his movies was he wanted evil, first and foremost, to be clearly, distinctively evil. And he said he wanted to make sure that everyone who looked at the villain knew they were the villain and knew that they were evil. And then secondly, he said that evil could never triumph. Evil could never win in the end. He wanted to make sure that that was very clear. So you go back through the catalog of Disney movies from 1937 with Cinderella, Snow White, and move all the way up to 101 Dalmatians, and even to Fox and the Hound, which was still on the drawing board at the time. There's a clear set of evil, and there's a clear villain, and the villain can never triumph.
Yeah, I mean, and he was good with evil being really evil and scary.
Wanted it to be very clear.
Yeah, right? Because, I mean, the stories of when Snow White is released in the original the theater in New York, I think, where they released it, is they had to, it had so terrified the children that it required extra cleanup after the movie was over because, scared kids, weak bladders.
Yeah.
So this was all within his wheelhouse. This is something he wanted. Evil needed to be really evil. It makes sense culturally too, right? Because we're in this culture, right? 1937, one of Hitler's favorite movies is Snow White, which is interesting.
Yes.
And but as good Americans, we needed to make sure there's a very clear line of what is evil and what isn't evil. That's where we are culturally, and we're there all the way through the 50s. And into the 60s, but in the 60s, this starts getting a little
It does.
gray.
In the 1960s, you start questioning who the good guys are and the bad guys are. Yeah. Funny story about that. I was a little kid, and 60s, there were still a lot of Westerns on television. And one of my favorite Westerns was a Western about Jesse James. And I had no idea as a little boy that Jesse James was a bad guy. And this television show, did absolutely nothing to dissuade the opinion that Jesse James was a good man. He was just a normal, everyday guy.
Yeah.
And Jesse James, I remember my mother sitting me down and saying, "Listen, Jesse James historically is a villain. He's a bad guy. He's a robber. He's a murderer." And I'm like, no, how could that be? And that's part of that blur that starts taking place in the 60s.
What year is Robin Hood produced?
The
animated
Disney? The animated Robin Hood?
Okay.
That's like 67, 68.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But see, Robin Hood isn't a bad guy.
No.
Okay? Robin Hood is
He is a good guy in a bad world.
Yes.
Right.
Right.
We definitely know that Prince John is evil.
Right.
And the Sheriff of Nottingham is worse.
Right.
We get all of that.
By the
Hood's a
way,
good guy.
there's a whole like political thing there that people totally miss. Robin Hood robs from the rich and gives to the poor.
Yeah.
The people that he's robbing is the government.
Yeah. Oh, that's fun. That's another
Yeah. So it's not like,
Not the government robbing from the rich to give to the poor.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's funny how we've
kind of missed that up a little bit. But anyway, back to Cruella.
back
to
so
Cruella.
this is all backstory. This is where you're coming from.
Yeah, this is where I'm coming from. So I sit down and I watch the movie. And the movie, first of all, the movie's very well done, I think. It draws a really good story.
Great story. Acting is awesome.
Yeah. Creates for those of you who haven't seen it, just to give you a sketch, you begin with a young girl who has Estelle. Is that her name?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. So her name is Estelle. Of course, that name means star, which is kind of interesting. So you have Estelle. She has an unusual hair color. In that half of her hair is black and half of her hair is white. And Estelle loves fashion. And she has a mother who also is encouraging her in fashion. And then her mother dies in a very tragic situation.
Because it is a Disney movie and we have to lose a parent always.
Yeah. The whole Bambi thing, like very early.
Yeah.
And which, by the way, that's because I think that part of that is that Walt also liked that concept because he was trying to show that you could overcome your adversity.
Right, and the most adverse thing a child could think of.
Exactly.
Many of us could think of.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So, but loses her parents. She's now basically a street urchin. Comes upon two others who basically take her into their gang, and she grows up as a villain.
As a thief, as a villain, as a pickpocket. Yep.
Yeah, a thief, a pickpocket. There's a moment in her life where Estelle attempts to go straight, if you will, and that doesn't work well at all. And she eventually breaks into the fashion scene kind of in an unusual way with a very wicked and evil person. And
who we know is evil all the way through.
Well, all right. Yeah, that's true. That's true. Yeah. Yeah.
All right, so this is a thing, right?
So, yes.
So we finished this movie, and you kind of are cheering for Cruella, and I think that's the thing that bothers you. Is that fair?
Probably, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, and I get that, especially with the background of what Disney is, and really just as a Christian too. Like, we don't want to ever cheer for evil. And, but I watch a movie like this, and I think I am fascinated by the perspective of it. I think it's a great story to go in and talk about what makes a villain a villain. And this is different because Disney also did this with Maleficent, right? And I actually think this movie is different than Maleficent because what the story with Maleficent is a misunderstood person who is made the villain by people who are actually villains but they come out as a good story, right? Like that actually, I could see that being more bothersome, right? Like the actual villains when you finish Maleficent are Aurora's parents, not Maleficent.
Right.
And there's this
I
healing of all of this, right?
That movie is one that
Misunderstood.
really grates on me.
Yeah,
Yes.
sure. So that's like misunderstood villain, and we've just cast history wrong because, if there's anything any student learns about history now, it's just that history is written by the victors, and that has influenced how history is interpreted ever since.
Right.
History is still history. So anyway, we won't go down that route necessarily today. So anyway, I could see that series. There's two of those movies, I think. I could see that bothering you. But I feel like this one's different than that because at the end of the day, though you understand Cruella a little bit better because you get this backstory, you're actually seeing her develop into the evil character that she becomes in like the animated feature. And just because you have more background on why somebody is evil doesn't necessarily make them good. It just gives better like story to the development of that evil. And And it's just, I think it's an interesting like work on somebody giving into their madness. And to go theological on this, I would say that what makes Cruella the evil character that she is that at some point she has to deal with the fact that she is a fallen, broken human being, and she gives in to the evil nature that is within all of us, rather than finding a way to find redemption from the evil that is in all of us.
Right. She is overcome by revenge, greed.
Yeah.
Yes, anger, all of those things.
Right. Which
so
I guess the story gives us some understanding on why she would go that way. Like there, you could even say that there's some mental health predisposition to that. But at the same time, like she still makes this choice to pursue the evil path rather than to pursue righteousness. And honestly, to go even more spiritual on this, we all make that choice. And we all go that direction on choosing evil, because none of us can choose good without the intervention of Jesus in our lives. And the intervention of goodness for Cruella is gone.
Yes, it doesn't happen. It doesn't happen.
So the question that comes out of Cruella for a lot of us that we can look at this is say, like, do the circumstances and the nurturing of this young woman create the evil, or is this like something that she's born with that she can't fight? So nature has created this evil, and ultimately she can't help being evil, so we have to feel sorry for her. And that is an interesting conversation.
That is.
But at the same time, I, as a theologian, I look at that and say, well, yeah, no wonder. Like, this is where we all go.
Okay. I still didn't like the movie. I get that. I get that understanding.
Yeah.
I guess there are a couple of other things I thought were interesting to me about the movie. I loved it. I loved the offset. I did enjoy the actual production of it, which was interesting. Except that I do have to say, I felt like the first 15 to 20 minutes of the movie was laborious. Mm-hmm. Just really, really difficult to get into.
It didn't get really fun until Jasper and Horace show up.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. It just, you're looking at the story and you're saying, okay, I've got to go with this just because it's got to get better. Mm-hmm. And fortunately it does. Mm-hmm. But that first 15, 20 minutes is just laborious. And it's important to the story.
Yeah, you need it.
Yeah, you do need that. But I found, so here's one of the things that I thought. I thought it was a very dark movie for a Disney production. Mm-hmm. I actually equate it to The Dark Knight, a Batman movie.
Yeah.
Very, very much like a Batman movie. In fact, you could almost say that that Cruella is a monochromatic Harley Quinn with, well, maybe Joker.
Yeah, female Joker. Which I guess Harley
female
Quinn's
Joker.
Kinda,
yeah.
Yeah, she's not as vapid as
Harley Quinn. Definitely. Harley doesn't have many.
Yeah.
She's just there. But you get those tie-overs because, I mean, that shocking black-white hair color mm-hmm. that is her hair, you look at it and it's almost like a black and white Harlequin. Mm-hmm. And you get that. Of course, her dress, some of the events, you just kind of feel like, am I watching Batman or am I watching Cruella? What is this here?
Maybe in the sequel, Batman comes and rescues the dogs.
Oh, wouldn't that be nice? Yeah.
I like that idea.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting. I thought the movie was pretty cool, and I really liked where it's going. I'm excited that there's a sequel in the works. I think that it'll be interesting to see that. I'm a little bit bothered if you watch the post-credits scene about where Pongo and Perdita come from. That one messes with me a little bit. I'm not sure about that, or if they thought that one all the way through. If you haven't watched, if you don't know what I'm talking about yet, you should watch the post-credit scenes. That's just a thing now. Like, I know a bunch of people who didn't know that existed, and you should just always check at this point. That's what movies do now. It's like doing an encore bit for a band. Like, a lot of movies run a post-credit scene. You should hang out until the black screen and white letters come out.
Yes.
But anyway, so there's something that happens at the end. It's worth checking out. And then, it'll, we were introduced to Pongo and Perdita at the end, and I think it's just interesting. So overall though, I thought it was cool, and I like this, but I get where you're coming from on feeling some discomfort, but I'm curious to see where it goes from here in the sequel.
It's true. And, this is something parents, this is something worth keeping in mind. You can redeem movies. Mm-hmm. Because you can sit and talk with your kids about what you've just watched and put it into a theological context. You're not looking to shred it. Well, some things you're going to shred, but you're not looking to. You're looking to come up with the concepts, not she's driving a devil car. That misses the point. It's more along the lines of who is this character? How does this character fit with what we know from Scripture? What could have changed that would have addressed Cruella's character earlier? Those things. For example, what is the power of having parents in your life, or what influence do you think would have happened in her life if her mother had continued to live? Mm-hmm. Or those things are all part of a good conversation that anyone can have, especially with your high school kids, as you're dealing with just about any movie or theatrical presentation out there.
Yeah, this is a skill. This is a developed skill that I think Christians are called to. Here's the tension. I think a lot of us we choose to either be entertained or informed. And that's hard. It's hard to be entertained by something and still apply our knowledge of Scripture and eternity to that mode of entertainment. I think, Christian, you're allowed to be entertained by stuff. You're allowed to go and find entertainment and go have fun and consume culture and just to consume it for enjoyment's sake. That's totally allowed.
Yes.
But you should also be able to interact with it on a level beyond just entertainment. And especially for parents, but I think for all of us, we should be able to take, pop songs, or we should be able to take pop movies. We should be able to take books that are on the bestseller list and be able to enjoy them for what they are, but also be able to take them to the second level of how do I process this information as a believer. That's worth doing. And don't be so lazy as to just take the surface stuff of this has a devil in it, it's bad. Actually think about the layers of character building and all these other things, and have conversations with people around you and develop this. It's a healthy thing to do.
Very, very.
Yeah. So there you go. Yeah. So that's a quick thought on, I don't know if it's quick, but it's a thought on Cruella and just movies in general. Kim and I went and saw another movie last week before. Time blends together. And we even walked away from that movie, which we really enjoyed, with these moments, there was a line or two in that were the writers of this movie tapped into great theology and they didn't even realize it. And that was just fun to have a conversation about together. And that's the kind of stuff that we should be doing as Christians, is to be able to walk away from something and see the fingerprints of God in it, even if the people who wrote it and made it didn't realize it.
Right. And that comes back to worldview, mm-hmm. And putting your life in perspective and viewing life through the perspective of God, God's plan, what God is doing in our world, and knowing that God is active.
Yeah.
So if God is active, then you'll see those blind squirrel moments, as I call them, where people just backed into something theologically accurate or created something that's theologically dissonant without
even
knowing it.
Yeah. It's fun.
Yeah.
So there are a few minutes left, and we just started a new sermon series, and I was wondering if we could just hit that for a little bit to to set some groundwork on where you're hoping to go as we dig into the book of Joshua, at least the first part of the book of Joshua. And we're talking about success in life through this lens of the first, was it 10 chapters we're doing?
Yeah, we're going to get
11 chapters.
Yeah, we're going to get about 10 chapters in. And I just have been interested in the book of Joshua and applying this concept of success because this book, as I mentioned yesterday in my sermon, when you get to the book of Joshua, you are at like the high point of Israel's spirituality. Now, I realize that it's not very long into the existence of Israel that you get into this high point, and that's pretty sad. That you have a couple of other points in their history where they rise up again, but they just continuously fail forward from this point on. Mm-hmm. And so I looked at it and I said, well, here's this man who steps into this role, and Israel is at its, let's call it at its best, at its peak, and just all of these great things happen, and some bad things. Mm-hmm. You have and you have the Gibeonite story, and all of those are in the first 10 chapters. But there's so much success here, and it's the promise that God makes to Joshua in verse 8 of chapter 1. He just says, follow me, follow my directions. I'm going to make you prosperous and give you good success. And I said, well, then this book is about success. Here's God's promise to Joshua, and you don't see God rescinding that. You don't see in 24 chapters of Joshua, you don't see God saying, oh, you blew it and we're done here.
Right.
And no more success for you.
Right. Yeah. Well, in a sense, you're seeing the beginning. What makes Joshua fun for me is you're seeing the beginning of the book of Deuteronomy played out through the rest of Scripture. Yes. Right? So you're seeing these blessings. You're seeing the table has been set by Moses and by the children of Israel who have made it through Numbers. And you're starting off in the positive blessings of Deuteronomy, and the rest of the Old Testament story is the negative of Deuteronomy and the consequences of sin, which comes because the generation of Joshua doesn't teach its next generation.
Exactly, right. And so that's an interesting thing that I was thinking about even yesterday. I didn't have a chance to really incorporate it into my sermon, but it was something that I was thinking about yesterday, and that is, these are second generation people. Mm-hmm. I have often heard the slight, if you will, on second generation Christians, like that. You have that first generation. So, for example, my mom got saved when she was like 15, 16 years old, and her family was really, really changed by an uncle of mine who had gone to Sunday school, got saved, then basically led the entire family, 4 brothers, my mom, the 5 children, my grandmother and grandfather, they all got saved, just because her one brother went to church, came back and taught them all, and boom, they were all saved. They were all baptized on an Easter Sunday. The sad thing, that this is a crazy story. My uncle, who had gone to Sunday school, had this life change, came back, basically brought life change to the entire family. He died on Good Friday of pneumonia, and the family was baptized on Easter Sunday after his death.
Oh, goodness.
And but the family said, no, this is what he would want, because just huge change, and the entire family is baptized together.
Wow.
But that, there's that joy, and there's that thrill from being saved. And then here I am. I'm basically a second generation Christian. I grew up in church. I joke about the fact that I was in church the first Sunday after I was born, because that's what my mom did, and I had all of the Sunday school ribbons. My Sunday school pin was equal to my age, because I had always been in Sunday school and never missed a date. So one of the issues that comes up is that second generation Christians are often shallow, because they don't have that
deep conversion experience.
Deep, right? They don't have the deep conversion experience, and they're never challenged. Is the idea? They don't have to be pressed on their faith. And I think that one of the things that you see in the book of Joshua is the opposite. You see a second generation who have watched their fathers dying in the wilderness because they had an opportunity to trust God and chose not to. Mm-hmm. Everybody over the age of 40 here in the book of Joshua, everybody over the age of 40 is basically remembering the revelation of God at Sinai, and now they're basically saying to themselves, "We're not going to do what our fathers did."
Well, there's only 2 people over the age of 40 when they enter in, right? Is it just Caleb and Joshua who are over the age of 40?
So you're going to have everybody. No, you're going to have
60. It'd be
60.
60. Right. Yeah.
Right.
Math is not my thing. I'm
Right.
sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, and they're actually about 75.
Yeah.
But yeah, so everybody else is basically under the age of 20 at Sinai. Mm-hmm. That was the cutoff age. That was kind of the point where anybody over the age of 20, at Kadesh Barnea. Mm-hmm. So everybody over the age of 20 dies in the 40 years of wandering. And now you've got some 60-year-olds who are saying, man, I remember God speaking at Sinai, and we're not repeating that problem. Mm-hmm. And you have an entire generation that has walked through the wilderness and said, I have seen the frustration of my parents because of their faithlessness. I'm not repeating that problem.
So then is Joshua's, the generation that we're beginning the book of Joshua with, actually first-generation believers?
That's an interesting, well, maybe. I mean, so here's the thing about first-generation believers, and some of you are first-generation believers, and the reality is you come in with a huge load of baggage, right? You come in with all of and this was the issue that those people that died in the wilderness came in with, is that they had been to Egypt. They had all kinds of sin. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of the essence of the book of Deuteronomy, right? Because it's saying, no, you can't divorce your first wife so that you can marry your second wife, so that you can divorce her and go back and marry the first one again. That doesn't work. That's not legit.
Yeah, they had to kind of de-Egypt the people of Israel.
They had to and so the first generation of Christians, if you come to Christ, say in your 20s, you got some stuff. Mm-hmm. If you just have some stuff, and some of that stuff is just going to hang around with you for the rest of your life. But your kids are going to see your stuff, mm-hmm. and they're going to make decisions that say, "I'm not going there. I'm not going to get caught up with my family. My mom and dad got caught up with in their lives."
Yeah. So the first generation experiences it and changes, hopefully. The second generation observes it, right? And that's kind of where we're at with Joshua, is this generation that has observed the consequence of the first generation's tension between pursuing righteousness and having the old man kind of still rule. And then that third generation that comes after Joshua has no idea. They've just grown up in it.
Yeah, exactly. And that third generation is kind of saying, maybe it's because the second generation, they just didn't want to talk about what happened in the wilderness.
Maybe.
There's no conversation with their children about, see, here's what happened to grandma and grandpa,
Right.
Big crevice opened up, gone.
Yeah,
yeah. And then closed back up again. They're out there somewhere.
Yeah.
But they didn't have that conversation. They didn't deal with, hey, these were the sins of your family. Mm-hmm. This is where we have been, and this is where they were just there. They were content with the fact that God is successful in their life.
Yeah. We've done this, we've lived this, we've found success. Right.
Yes.
And so it's going to be an interesting thing to take it's an interesting direction for us to take in this sermon series, because we're going to talk about how to find success, but we're going to probably at some point address the failure of those who were successful.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And so, but this is what I liked where we were yesterday with this conversation is as an American, I love a good success story. And I love a good success story that comes out of adversity. And I love
Like Bambi's mom.
yeah. And I love like all of like those stories kind of capture my imagination. And I think all of us ultimately want to be successful. But the idea of defining what successful is in God's economy is going to be a worthwhile pursuit here. Because I think a lot of us look for success in world terms, not necessarily in God terms.
Yeah, that's an ongoing problem. And of course we have an entire wing of, I guess I call them Christianity, that, you measure God's blessing, God's success in your life by your bank account, or how many G7s you have, and that's like the pastor from Louisiana that I read about a couple of years ago, who was complaining because his church wouldn't buy him the newest jet.
Right, the new private jet, because the old one was, and he needed it. That's one of the most cringy interviews I've ever seen. Him trying to talk about why he needed those private jets. It's definitely, it's definitely a cringy thing for I think a believer to observe, as other believers taking advantage of people to try and fuel their pursuit of worldly success.
Exactly.
But there is a difference. Like you mentioned this yesterday. I think our reaction to that is often, well, then all people who are wealthy are evil at some level, and everybody who has experienced some form of worldly success needs to be distrusted. And so that's going to be an interesting thing too. Like God still blesses. You can read Proverbs and God still tangibly blesses people who follow him. I think I've said this in our student ministry. If you play the game according to the rules of the game maker, it's going to be a better experience. Right? Like
Always.
If you're gonna go play a sport, I watched, football started this weekend, and if you're gonna play a sport according to the rules, you're gonna get fewer yellow flags, you're gonna get fewer penalties, and you're probably gonna have a better chance of winning the game. And I think for Christians, like there is this proverbial sense of, if we're going to live our lives through the lens of Scripture and make decisions in ways that are God honoring, there are probably going to be moments of tangible success, a worldly success and benefit from doing that, because God ultimately set up the rules for where we live.
Here's something to wrap your brain around, right? Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were filthy rich. Mm-hmm. I mean, Abraham brings, in a famine, shows up in Egypt, and Pharaoh decides that he needs to entertain this man.
Right. Yeah.
In fact, the whole situation with Lot is one where Abraham and Lot are it's like...
We're both so wealthy we can't live on the same street.
Yeah, so like Steve Jobs and Bill Gates. How do we survive in the same state? We just can't. We're going to have
to go to California.
Yeah. we have to separate because we just have too much.
Yeah. So that again, like all of that's there. So this is going to be an interesting thing to unwind, and I'm looking forward to this series.
Yes,
because on the one hand, I think that one of the most cringy things you can do is talk about the pursuit of worldly success through the lens of Scripture. When a pastor does that and evaluates your success based on like the things that you have in this world, I'm like, Matthew talks about that stuff all disintegrates. But at the other hand, God does tend to bless people who are faithful to him. Not always.
True. Not always.
Not that's always. True. Because right next to Proverbs, you've got Ecclesiastes. So you know that it doesn't always work out that way. But it can. It can. And so it's going to be interesting to walk through this. What is success in God's world and what isn't? What's touched by God's success and what isn't? And I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah. It'll be good.
Yeah.
It'll be good.
So tune into those. That sermon series, it just kicked off yesterday. You can stream our services on our website. We have a YouTube page also. So if you're curious about how that kicked off, you can check that out. And then also we have this podcast. We're here almost every Monday.
Yeah.
And we're hoping that it's an encouragement to you, and it's also encouragement to people that you know. So the things that you can best do to support this podcast, we're not running ads or anything like that. We're not looking for financial success off of it. But what would be successful for our podcast would be if the audience grew. And so if you can, the two things you can do to help with that are to like every episode you listen to, like rate it in whatever app you listen to, and then also share it with people. Throw it out on your Facebook page. It's even more powerful if you can just tell a friend about it and show them how to pull up the podcast if they're not podcast people. Share it. We think we hope it would be an encouragement, and connect with us through our Facebook page. That's always a help too. So thanks for joining us. We'll see you next week. You have been listening to Inside the Pastor Study podcast with Pastors George and Jeremy Stevens. Artwork by Caitlin Gallagher, music by Sam Demetrius, and engineering help from Ashley Gallagher. To find out more about us, head to marshcorner.com.